By being a part of what we're doing here, not only are you a part of Christians for Freedom, but you're a part of something much bigger than the test we have tomorrow, than the class we have, our major, or what we're studying. We're a part of making sure that our country continues on the right track for the generations to come. And, somebody asked me yesterday while we were tabling, he was like, who do you want for president? And I said, I want the person who is going to return us to our most constitutional values. And those are the values that we founded on. And I believe that that's what we're doing here tonight. It's like the Israelites when they were walking around in the desert. They always had to come back to God because they just turned away from Him. And when the Founding Fathers couldn't decide on the Constitution, they said, let's get on our knees and pray. So AJ, would you mind starting us off in prayer?
All right, let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this day, giving us today, Lord, and I thank you for giving us this opportunity to come here and meet tonight, Lord, and I pray that you will speak through the speaker tonight, Lord, and just allow us to learn something that we can apply to our lives, Lord, to help better this nation. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.
Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. We got a great event planned. I'm so happy that y'all are here. We got a great speaker for y'all, and I want to open it up to Shannon Robinson to tell about a few events that we have coming up in the next few weeks.
All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out, and we are so excited that you're here because this is something so much bigger than us. This is about you guys, and this is about our nation. You can find us on upcoming events. So our upcoming events are prayer meetings. We will be hosting those every other week. We had our first one just last Tuesday, and it was really powerful, and it was a great event. It's just a time for us to come together and pray as a nation, pray as students for our nation. Our next prayer meeting is February 9th at 7:30 p.m. And also our final prayer meeting will be our prayer bash, and we are trying to schedule that at the prayer chapel. So that event will be our biggest prayer meeting, and we'll light lanterns and fill the air with them. So that'll be a really great time you don't want to miss at the end of the semester. We are planning to host 3 or 4 more major events this semester. If you would like to recommend any speakers to us, anybody that you would like to hear or you feel would really impact us here, then please say something. You can email me, send me a text message, just get a hold of me somehow, see me after. C4F is on Twitter. We're also on Facebook and also on Instagram as well. We plan to have speakers like former Congressman Joe Walsh, also the Benham brothers, and David Barton, the founder of Wall Builders. All right, and we have other team-led events, and like I said, if you would like to have anybody that you feel would greatly impact all of you, then that would be great. Just let us know. Okay. I would like to now introduce Marissa George. She is the Vice President of Christians for Freedom. She is from Atwater, California, and she is a Western Legal Traditions with a minor of Politics and Policy, and she is a senior this year. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. Now I'm going to introduce our speaker, someone who is near and dear to my heart because I actually interned for him 2 summers ago, Roman Buhler, the National Director of the Madison Coalition. This is Roman. He graduated from Stanford University with his undergrad and went to USC for law school. He served as a committee counsel for Newt Gingrich for 15 years. I did some great things in Congress. Like I said, he is the national director for the Madison Coalition, and he is working on 2 constitutional amendments. The first is Regulation Freedom Amendment, which would require states to approve of major new federal regulations. And how he wants to do it is actually empower the states to force Congress to pass that, which he will tell you much more about that. And he also would like to pass the Balanced Budget Amendment with that same strategy. So let's give a big round of applause for Roman Buhler.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank Marissa for inviting me down here. She as you all know, is an extraordinary leader. And I was so excited to have her working with us for the summer. And one of the reasons I came is I thought, if Marissa's part of this group, there have got to be some leaders in this room who are going to change the country. And I want to help you do that. So, why did I come 200 miles here? Because I think in this room, there might be 12 of you who will change the world. Now, can anybody here think of a group of 12 people who changed the world? Anybody want to talk about the 12 people that changed the world?
Disciples.
There you go. Right? So probably none of you have ever thought of yourself as one of 12 people who could change the world. But I'm here to tell you that the world needs you. And I'm also here to tell you that there might be a way for some of the people in this room to do something that all of the politicians in Washington together can't do. And that is to turn this country around. Now, my story is that I got involved in politics when I was in college. I read some books about how young people could make a difference. I was the president of my college Republican club at Stanford University. And I decided that I would try an experiment. I would see if someone who wasn't a millionaire, wasn't a movie star, didn't intend to be a United States senator, could make a difference in the politics of this country. And I still don't know the answer to that question, but I've spent my life trying. So I spent many years in grassroots politics in California, organizing young people. The people I organized got older. I ended up managing a campaign for state Republican Party chairman in California and won with a network of people like you that had grown up and learned about politics. And in 1989, I got this phone call, and I ended up being hired as Newt Gingrich's first committee counsel. Now, I didn't work for Newt for 15 years. I worked for him, and then he became, as a committee counsel, then he became the Republican whip and then the Republican speaker. And I stayed on as a committee counsel for 14 years for the Republican majority in the House of Representatives. And it was an absolutely extraordinary time. We'd all dreamed that someday Republicans would win a majority in Congress and that we could change the country. And half of that dream came true. We did, in fact, win a majority. But we didn't change the country. Because politicians and majorities of politicians in Washington are temporary. And so we got welfare reform passed, but we never could get 60 votes to do more permanent stuff. And even the laws we passed have eroded over time. And so my thinking about how to change American politics and how to turn the country around has evolved over time. And I now believe that it's the Constitution that is the key to restoring the checks and balances that the authors of that Constitution intended. And when I look at the country from a broad perspective, I see two great problems. And they're problems that we're not able to solve with temporary majorities in Washington, D.C. The first problem is that increasingly we are governed not by laws passed by majorities of the House and Senate and signed by the President. We're not governed by laws approved by elected representatives of people. We're governed by regulations issued by bureaucrats in Washington who are accountable to no one except for the President of the United States. And particularly in the last 4 years of a president's term, that president's accountable to no one at all because they're never going to run for re-election. And so what's happening now is because of decisions made by the courts have allowed bureaucrats to take a law passed 30 years ago and reinterpret it in ways that were never intended by the members of Congress who voted for that law and impose that on people and put people in jail or fine them who break that law, who break that regulation. Now, we fought an American Revolution to end taxation without representation. And what we've got today is regulation without representation. And so whether you care about Second Amendment rights, those are under assault by federal regulators. Religious freedom, it's under assault by federal regulators. If you want to invest in a business and grow a business, that ability is under assault by federal regulators. And in fact, you can make an argument that the single greatest impediment to economic growth in this country is not a very bad tax system, and we have a pretty bad tax system. It is the fact that if you start a business, you can't predict over the next 10 years what crazy, stupid, overregulated nonsense is going to come out of Washington. You can't predict it because it all depends on the whim of the bureaucrats and the president that appointed them. And if you're thinking about investing and you know that you can't predict the regulatory environment, this country is not as good a place to invest as it might be. And there's an argument that the single greatest thing we could do to jumpstart economic growth and make sure all of you and your classmates have good, high-paying jobs through your career, the single thing that we could do to make that happen would be to curb the authority of federal regulators, to establish once again that regulations, like laws, have to have the consent of the governed. So that's the first problem that I see. And if you look at presidential candidates today, some of them are talking a little bit about regulation, but I haven't heard very many of them say, I want to give away my power to impose regulations on the rest of you. I want Congress to approve all my regulations. I haven't heard them say that. Now, in private and in little written statements they've said it, but I haven't heard it on the campaign trail. So that's one problem. The second problem is much worse. Now, I want to see a show of hands. How many of you would generally agree with the statement that politicians in Washington are borrowing too much money and they're leading the country in the direction of bankruptcy and leaving your generation with the bill? Hands, how many people agree with that? Does anybody disagree with that? I don't see any hands. So the question is, what do we do about it? Now, it would be great to have a president and a Congress that gave us a balanced budget for a few years. But one of the things about politics is it's like the weather. Sometimes it's good weather, sometimes it's bad weather. The only thing we can predict for sure in the next 20 years is that there are probably going to be some majorities in Congress that are more fiscally responsible and some that aren't. Now, maybe cynics would say there'll never be a majority in Washington that's fiscally responsible. But even if there is, it only is temporary. So the solution to the problem of overborrowing is not just electing good politicians in Washington, it's constitutional. And that's why we need some kind of balanced budget or fiscal discipline amendment that limits what politicians in Washington can borrow. Because it's too easy to just avoid the hard budget choices and pass the bill on to your generation. So when I look at these two big problems, the problem of regulatory dictatorship and regulation without representation, and the problem of overborrowing, which is leading the country toward bankruptcy, I see constitutional solutions as the answer. So what I'm here to talk to you tonight about is how we get those constitutional solutions. And the second is that the key to getting those constitutional solutions isn't the politicians in Washington. It isn't even the politicians in Richmond. It isn't even the community leaders in downtown Lynchburg. It's you. It's you. If this problem is going to be fixed, it's because you're going to fix it. And, you know, I don't know how many of you follow international affairs, but, you know, in the Ukraine, there was something called an Orange Revolution. There was a communist dictatorship, and the Orange Revolution swept it out of power. And that Orange Revolution was led by people like you. In Egypt, there was a dictatorship. It was swept out of power by young people in Tahrir Square. Now, what we got was maybe not what we expected, but it was swept out of power by young people. What are the Chinese terrified of? They're terrified of those young people who died at Tiananmen Square, inspiring a new generation of young people, which is why they arrest anybody who even opens their mouth while they're trying to block the internet, because they're afraid of people like you. But here in this country, we have incredible freedoms. How many of you have a smartphone? Put your smartphone in the air. With that smartphone, each one of you could send an email to 100 state legislators. It's the most incredible tool invented in the last probably 20 years. And you all have one. It makes you enormously powerful. Right? I mean, the terrorists in Iraq have RPGs, right? They can, shoot a missile for a couple of 100 yards and blow up a building. You have a smartphone. And with that smartphone, you can take an idea and send it to 1,000 people. And if it's a good one, you can put it on YouTube and 20 million people will see it. You have more power than any other group of young people in history. It's truly extraordinary. And so I'm here to tell you how you can use that power. So the first step is, how do you change a constitution? If what we need is a regulation amendment and what we need is a balanced budget, how do we get those done? Well, how many of you, just as a curiosity, how many of you have a copy of the Constitution with you? That's pretty impressive. There are people who have. So if you turn to Article 5 of the Constitution, Article 5 of the Constitution is really simple. And I know this sounds like a law school class, and so just bear with me. Article 5 says, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution. In English, that means 2/3 of Congress can propose an amendment. And we've had 27 amendments that were proposed that way and then ratified by 3/4 of the states. And then Article 5 goes on. Or, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, Congress shall call a convention proposing amendments. So what that means in English is that if 2/3 of the states demand that Congress call a convention, Congress has to call the convention. And so that's the second method. And there are now 4 movements out there which are working in different ways to get a convention to propose amendments. And then there's a third way to propose amendments. And no one talks about it. But it's the way 3 times in American history that amendments have happened. And it's extraordinary to me that no one talks about this third method of getting an amendment proposed. And it is the way that the Bill of Rights was proposed. It is the way that most recently presidential term limits was proposed. And 100 years ago, it was the way that the 17th Amendment, which gave voters the right to directly elect senators, was proposed. So 3 times in American history, this method has been used. And it's very simple. The states have gotten together and forced Congress to propose an amendment. Now, why could the states force Congress to propose an amendment? Well, it's because Congress is terrified of the idea of a convention that might be more powerful than Congress. So when 2/3 of the states that have the power to call a convention seem to be getting together to propose an amendment, Congress says, don't worry about this convention thing, we'll take care of it. And they proposed the Bill of Rights, they proposed the 17th Amendment, they proposed the 22nd Amendment, and there's some other things Congress has done to head off what they thought was a movement from the states. Now, there may be some reforms which will require us to hold a convention. But there's some problems, there's some challenges when you start talking about a convention. If I told one of you, here's $1,000, I gave you $1,000, and I said, now your investment strategy, I want you to invest it by going out on the street and giving it to somebody you don't know, and they'll invest it for you. Would you think that was a good investment strategy?
No.
Maybe not. If you go to a group of politicians, and look, let's be honest about politicians. Politicians ran for office because they wanted political power and influence. If you tell a bunch of politicians, hey, got a great idea for you. You call this convention, and a group of politicians that you may know or you may not know are going to draft some amendments which you might like or you might not like, right? That's a hard sell for the 4,000 legislators who are majorities in the most limited government minds of 2/3 of the states. Because politicians don't like to give away power. So when you say to politicians, let's call a convention and you'll hope you control it, they're going, And that's one of the reasons why, after several years of activity, we haven't been able to get a convention, and why in 200 years there's never been a convention, because it's a hard sell. Now, groups like Convention of the States and the Balanced Budget Task Force are working very hard to overcome those challenges. And they're doing incredible work. And I encourage anybody who's interested to be involved in those efforts. But there's another way of making a constitutional amendment happen. And it's very, very, very simple. If you can get the 4,000 legislators in the 2/3, the 34 states, who are majorities in the 2/3 of the states, to agree on the text of a specific amendment they want, they have the power to force Congress to propose that amendment. Now, most of them don't understand that they have that power. They think all they have the power to do is to call a convention. They haven't been taught how, working together, they can force Congress to propose a specific amendment they want. And my organization, the Madison Coalition, has spent the last 2 or 3 years working on educating legislators about that strategy. And I'll tell you a story. 5 years ago, I had a meeting with a fellow by the name of Ed Meese. How many of you anybody ever heard of Ed Meese? A few of you. He was Ronald Reagan's Attorney General. And we asked Ed Meese, what do we do? Our own political people, our own politicians in Washington, Republican politicians, don't seem to be able to limit the growth and abuse of federal power. What do we do? And he said, you ought to look at an idea that I proposed when I was Reagan's Attorney General. And I remember saying, what's that? And thinking, wow, this is going to be good. And he said, and these are his words, give the states the same power as Congress to propose a specific amendment to the Constitution. And then he looked at me and he said, now you got to get the wording right. And then he repeated what he'd said. And I thought, why is Ed Meese telling me? I'm a retired federal employee. Why is he telling me this? And it turns out that the organization he worked for wasn't focused on that particular issue. They were focused on getting Congress to do different things, not on taking power away from Congress. And so I helped put together a legal team led by a guy named David Rivkin. Does anybody here by any chance read the Wall Street Journal? A couple of people read the Wall Street Journal. So you might have seen David Rivkin's columns in the Wall Street Journal on constitutional issues. He was also the key outside counsel for the 26 states that sued to overturn Obamacare. One of the top constitutional lawyers in the country. And working with David, we put together a legal team that came up with a strategy for doing what Ed Meese had suggested. And that strategy involves giving the states and making sure that the states know how to use the power that the authors of the Constitution intended them to have, which is the power to limit the scope and subject of any convention that they decided to call. Now, the Constitution says that states have the power to call a convention, but it is silent on whether the states have the power to control the agenda of that convention. The Constitution doesn't say. So we don't know what the Supreme Court would say. But we do know what James Madison said when he wrote the Federalist Papers explaining what the Constitution meant. And what James Madison said in Federalist 43 was, it, meaning the Constitution, equally enables the general and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors as they may be pointed out by the experience of one side or another. And that's on the back of the folder here. And what he meant by that was that the states and Congress had the same ability to propose an amendment. And even the liberals at the American Bar Association understand that if the states and Congress have the same ability to propose an amendment, it means that if the states have the power to call a convention, they also have the power to limit the convention to the amendment they want. So that is the fundamental argument for why states ought to have and ought to be recognized as having the power to limit a convention. Now there's one other reason. How many of you know what the 10th Amendment? How many of you have heard of the 10th Amendment? So the 10th Amendment says that basically if the Constitution doesn't prohibit the states from having the power, or it doesn't give the power specifically to the federal government, the states retain that power. The states and the people retain that power. And so if you ask the question, do the states have the power to limit a convention, the 10th Amendment, which was adopted after Madison wrote Federalist 43, would strongly suggest that the states have that power. So that's the constitutional argument. Now, can we rely on judges to follow the Constitution? No, right? Because they have their own ways of reading it, right? They think they can, some of them think they can rewrite the Constitution any way they want. So making constitutional arguments isn't going to give the states the power to limit a convention. But here's the way that states could. And before I go into the details, just think about this. If you're a member of Congress and 2/3 of the states come to you and say, Mr. Congressman, you have a choice. You can either propose the amendment 2/3 of us want, or we will force you to call a convention that will be limited to voting up or down on just the amendment we want. And since there are 2/3 of us, that amendment's probably going to pass. So if you're a congressman, do you think you want a convention convening that would be more powerful in Congress and a precedent for more? Or would you rather just get the states off your back by proposing the amendment? So that's why if states can limit a convention to an up or down vote on a single amendment, they can force Congress to propose the amendment they want. Now, what impact would that have? Suppose that at any point, 2/3 of the states could get together and force Congress to propose an amendment. Well, first of all, power would start flowing from Congress back to the states instead of the other way around. But think about it for a minute. If the states decided that they were unhappy with Congress's performance, what could they do? They could cut Congress's pay. Now, if you're a CEO of a company and there's a board of directors that can cut your pay, do you pay a lot of attention to the board of directors and what they want? Of course you do. And the problem with Congress is that they don't have a board of directors. They're accountable to no one but themselves, and they have to get reelected in a gerrymandered district with, lots of money that they raise from lobbyists. So most of them are pretty safe. Unless they get caught doing something unethical, then they're in trouble. But most of them are pretty safe. But they're not accountable to any other branch of government. But if 2/3 of the states now can force them to propose an amendment, suddenly Congress becomes accountable and power begins to flow away from Washington rather than toward it. So that's the impact of giving the states this ability that Ed Meese was talking about, to propose or force Congress to propose an amendment. Now, how do we do that? How does that happen? And so there are 4 safeguards that this team developed. Safeguard number 1 is a state law passed in a majority of states with a majority of the population. And that law, which we call a faithful delegate law, would give the states the power to replace a delegate who didn't follow states' instructions. So if 2/3 of the states called a convention, gave the delegates instructions, this is the only thing you could do, and the delegate tried to do something else, they could be replaced. So that law passed in 2/3 in a majority of states with a majority of the population is one safeguard. Now, the second safeguard is also a safeguard that could be done by the states. As you probably know, any amendment from a convention has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, which means it has to be ratified by 38 of the 50 states. So if 13 states don't ratify it, it can't go into effect. So if 13 states pass a state constitutional amendment that says we in this state will forbid the ratification of any amendment from a convention if the convention doesn't strictly follow the instructions from the states who called it, the convention can only do what the states who called it told it to do. So those are 2 things that could be done by the states. Now, there are 2 things that could be done by Congress. Any amendment from a convention has to go back to Congress before it can be ratified by the states. And Article 5 says that amendments shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by the conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. Which means Congress has to decide whether the states ratify through their legislatures or through their state conventions. And what that means is that if Congress decides that an amendment from a convention is illegal, they have a constitutional duty and they have the power to block that amendment. Now you might ask, well, what kind of amendment would be obviously illegal? And again, if you read Article 5, it says that no state, without its consent, shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate, which means in English every state has the same 2 votes in the Senate. So if the convention ever proposed an amendment that said New York and California and Illinois each get an extra vote in the Senate, that would be an unconstitutional amendment, and Congress, any member of Congress who'd sworn to uphold the Constitution would be obligated to block that amendment from going to the states. So, if Congress agrees with James Madison that states have the same power as Congress to propose an amendment, and Congress agrees that the states have the 10th Amendment right to limit the scope of a convention, then Congress could say if a convention ignores the instructions from the states, the convention's acted unconstitutionally, we're going to block the amendment. Now, what impact would that have if Congress recognized the authority of states to limit a convention? Well, on one hand, you might say it would reduce the power of Congress because now the states could force Congress to propose an amendment. But on the other hand, it would protect Congress against crazy amendments coming out of a convention that they might not want. So members of Congress might be conflicted. On one hand, some of them might not want to give more power to the states. On the other hand, they might say this is good protection against some, group taking over a convention and proposing a dangerous amendment. So what might move Congress in our direction to get them to recognize the authority of states? Two things. One is members of Congress right now are very worried because they are losing the power that they've had for 225 years to legislate. They're losing that power to power-hungry presidents who are now regulating, and they don't need Congress. So Congress, by empowering states, might help itself to take some of the power back that the presidency, the executive branch, has been stealing from Congress in recent years. And the other thing is that there are members of Congress who really do worry about the future of the country. And I've talked to, and they really, some of them got elected because they're worried about the bankrupting the country and they want a balanced budget amendment. That's the most important thing they ran for Congress to do. And most of them are smart enough to know that Congress is never going to propose a balanced budget amendment on its own. So if we can teach members of Congress that the way to get a balanced budget amendment is to partner with the states and empower the states to help persuade Congress to do this, and that the way to empower the states is to recognize the authority of states to limit a convention, we have a chance. And in fact, I've been talking to members of Congress and their staff, and there's some substantial interest in that idea. But no one's talking about that publicly. You haven't heard anybody at the presidential level talk about, well, I'm going to build a coalition of states to help force Congress to propose a balanced budget amendment. Nobody said that. It's all, I'm going to persuade Congress myself. You know, in my great persuasive abilities, I'm going to persuade Congress to do these things. No one's really talked about that strategy. So mechanically, what we're talking about is a rule in the U.S. House of Representatives that would recognize the authority of states. And since rules take 2/3 in the Senate, it would be a pledge by 51 senators. Now you think, well, how in the heck are you going to get a rule proposed by the U.S. House? How are you going to get 51 senators to take a pledge? And the answer is, you put a microphone in front of a member of Congress or a member of the Senate, and you say, Mr. Senator, Mr. Congressman, do you believe in the 10th Amendment right of states to protect the Constitution against a runaway convention? And the first time they're asked that question, they go, oh, I don't know what that means, right? But if enough people ask them, they're going to have to decide yes or no. And if we can make that a major issue in American politics, we might actually succeed. And so the combination of 2/3 of the states agreeing on an amendment and some of these safeguards could provide a way of changing the Constitution without a convention. Now let me just describe, and this is pretty complicated stuff. You know, you're not going to hear this in even most law school classes because most law school professors haven't figured it out. They've spent their time analyzing Supreme Court decisions, not the Article 5 process. But if you think about how American politics is aligned today, in the Senate we have a little over a few votes over 50 senators. In the House, we have a few votes over 240 members. We have majorities, Republicans, limited government people, have majorities but nowhere close to 2/3. But if you look at the states, there are 31 states now with Republican majorities in both houses of the legislature, and almost all of those legislators agree on two things. They agree there needs to be fiscal discipline in Washington. Most of them support a balanced budget amendment in one form or another, and they agree that federal regulators need to be reined in. Now, there are 7 more states where Republicans control one chamber and the Democrats control another chamber. But in some of those states, particularly in Kentucky, in New Mexico, in Iowa, the Democratic and Republican voters in those states both care a lot about energy, they care a lot about agriculture. And in both of those areas, federal regulators are perceived as hostile, as telling people what to do in ways that people don't like. And so the political architecture of the country right now is that there is very close to a 2/3 majority of states who might favor a reform of the regulatory process and who might favor some kind of fiscal discipline amendment. And so the question for us here in this room is, how do we put these ideas for getting a constitutional amendment together with the political coalition that can make it happen? And that's why you're so important. Because underneath that, those 4,000 legislators in the 34 most limited government-minded states are a whole network of grassroots groups and business groups who are all terrified at what's happening in Washington and want to do something about it, but they don't know what to do. And so the problem of educating those community leaders, some of them are political party organizations, some of them are grassroots conservative organizations, some of them are Tea Party organizations, some of them are Second Amendment groups, some of them are religious freedom groups, some of them are just chambers of commerce who just say, our businesses are being destroyed by regulators from Washington and we don't know what to do. But if they learn about this approach, if they learn that the path to reform in Washington is not going directly to Washington, but empowering states, they could make a difference. So, what do you have here at Liberty University? You have 14,000 students, many of whom came here because they care about the Constitution. Liberty University teaches about the Constitution. And you probably have a significant group of people who would actually like to do something. Not everybody's here in this room. You're a very select group. But there are probably a couple of thousand people here who, if you said you could do something to save the Constitution, they might be willing to do it. And so you think about who you know in your home community. I know some people are here from North Carolina, know a lot of people here from Virginia, know people who are here from Pennsylvania, for example. If you think about someone that you know in your home community, and you call them up and you say, you know, I heard this fascinating talk, or maybe it's not so fascinating, I heard this really boring talk, but he was kind of made sense, about a guy who used to be Newt Gingrich's first committee counsel, about how grassroots energy could help curb federal regulators and end irresponsible federal borrowing. Can I tell you about it because it might be of interest to someone in your community? And you have no idea how, maybe you do, how desperate people are for a strategy to make a difference. And so if each of you reached out to someone that you know in your community and told them about this, the idea could spread. And that's just plain ordinary grassroots stuff. And if any of you are really interested, we could give you a list of people in your community or your state who you might call and say, I heard about this great idea. And you know, people hear about, there's all kinds of ideas floating around out there, but when a student at Liberty University calls their friends, you have credibility because people know you learn stuff here that they don't know. That's why people sent you to come here. So you don't realize what an authority you are when you call people in your community and tell them what you've heard. Don't underestimate your power, right? You think of what those 12 apostles did, right? Think of yourself as a carrier of an idea, which could be, I'm not trying to say that any of us could do this, something that fundamental, but we could do a lot. So then there's the second approach. Remember, I asked all of you if you thought that politicians in Washington were bankrupting the country and leaving your generation with the bill. Now, the media is looking for people from the millennial generation to see, do any of you care? Are any of you going to do anything, right? And I don't know, maybe the way that this generation will work is all those kids that were out there working for Bernie Sanders are the representatives of the millennial generation. Or maybe all those people who were with Occupy Wall Street are the representatives of the millennial generation. But I don't think that they represent the millennial generation. I think that you could be leaders of the millennial generation by talking about the fact that politicians are bankrupting the country, leaving your generation with a bill. We need a balanced budget amendment, and the way to get it is to empower the states to force Congress to propose it. And I've been told by people at a major television network that if there were a group of 1,000 volunteers around the country who believed in this idea and we had some representatives, they would put those people on the air. Right? It's not going to work if you get academic credit for doing it, if you get paid for doing it, because there's a lot of that going on. If you and people like you, we can put together a network around the country of 1,000 young people who actually believe in this. I think that you could get the attention first of the conservative media and eventually of the mainstream media, and this thing would catch on like wildfire. And every politician in America would pick up the newspaper, watch television, and say, what are these young people talking about? They're empowering states to force Congress to propose a balanced budget amendment, and they're going to start asking, how does that work? And of course, we have leaders in the state legislatures of all these 34 states who are willing to tell people how it works if somebody will ask. But people have to see it in the media sometimes before they get interested. And frankly, no one's interested in seeing a retired federal employee used to work for Newt Gingrich on the air. I'm just another political hack, right? But you are news. If you decide to get involved, you can capture the attention and the imagination of people in this country in a way that the political class in Washington cannot. And that's your power. And that's the power, it's your power and it's the power of your friends. So what is our strategy to make this happen? Well, we have 3 levels of activity here. The first level is that we're asking people to become part of that 1,000-person group. And every one of you has a little sheet on your desk that says, don't bankrupt America. A new generation, a millennial generation of leaders can help save America from bankruptcy. Yes, I will be an advocate for Don't Bankrupt America by calling at least one state legislator in my state. So we're not asking you to make a major commitment of time. We're just saying, do you agree with us? And at some point, would you agree to make one phone call? So if you put your name and your contact information here, that takes us the next step toward our 1,000 people. And you might know some people here at Liberty who would be interested in being at that level. The second level of activity is we've got to have people from all over the country to feel like they're a community. And 30 years ago, you couldn't do it. Just wasn't a way to do it. But today, conference calls are free. Technology has made it possible to put 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people together on the phone for no money at all. And when it's 1,000 people, it doesn't cost very much. And so now, as interest in the political process increases, we now have a conference call every Tuesday night at 9:30 p.m. Eastern, which is in an hour and 15 minutes. Anybody who wants to can get I'll give them the conference code, and you can be on the phone with people from Nebraska, with people from Alabama, with people from California, with people from Massachusetts and Vermont, from all over the country. And our goal is to build that group until we've got 200 or 300 people on the phone every 2 weeks. And it's a 15-minute call. It's not like on and on and on and on. The idea is for people to introduce themselves so people feel this growing. And when it's big enough, we'll put politicians on the call to hear it for themselves. We'll put media people on the call. And that's our evidence to the media that this thing is growing. That it's not just, a handful of people who have an idea. It's a movement. And some of you may be able to figure out how to sell this on social media. Maybe someone will come up with a way to take their cute cats and put them on the air and it's the cats for, a balanced budget amendment. I don't know how to do that stuff. You might have some ideas. And then there's the third level, and that is that if you have a group of, I'd say 7 is kind of the critical number, in a particular place, you can go down and get a meeting with your member of Congress, with a state legislator. The idea that a group of young people would actually want to come down and meet with a legislator is still pretty unique because most people don't do that. And there are a couple of members of Congress who represent this area who probably be delighted to hear from a group of young people that cared about an idea that they generally agree with. And the more of that goes on, the more politicians begin to say, you know, this is a big thing. I better get out in front of it. And that's the way you teach politicians to be leaders, is you say, here's an idea, it's a good one, and it's always hardest to find the first one. The second one is a little less hard, and by the time you got 50, everybody wants to join, particularly when it's a popular issue. And of course, 70% of the people want a balanced budget amendment. This is not exactly an unpopular idea. And members of Congress who want a balanced budget, they're frustrated. They don't know how to do it. So empowering the states might actually appeal to some of them. So those are the levels of activity, and what I'm really looking for here are people who might want to be leaders, because leaders are always in short supply. You know, we were extraordinarily fortunate 225 years ago to have the leaders that we had that formed committees of correspondence, that took the idea that most people thought was completely nutty at the beginning of independence from Great Britain and turned it into a movement, that turned it into a revolution, that turned it into a country. And these people, they sacrificed an enormous amount to do what they did. Many of the signers of the Constitution paid with their lives. Some of them were bankrupted. They made a huge sacrifice. In our time, you know, and I know one gentleman here is going into the United States Army, and I have an enormous respect for people willing to make that sacrifice. But I'm not here to say pick up a gun and risk your life. I'm here to say if you care about this country, find a way to make a difference. And I encourage you all to pick your presidential candidate, and maybe some of you will get on a bus and go up to New Hampshire and work for your favorite candidate, or maybe some of you will get on a bus and go to South Carolina in a couple of weeks and work for your favorite candidate, and I think it's great and it's important. But impacting the presidency is really hard. Impacting who's wins can be really hard. Something we all have to do, but it's really hard. And the presidency is only 4 years. And so what I'm suggesting is that a far smaller investment of time and energy could have 100 times more long-term impact. That if you decide to get involved in a movement to change the Constitution, to stop the irresponsible borrowing, to restore representative government by ending regulation without representation, you can actually have a meaningful impact. And if you think about it, you know, if any of us had been smart enough 30 years ago to invest in Microsoft, right? One of these buildings would be named after us, right? Political movements start because very motivated people get involved and make them grow. And we have a coalition now of 500 state legislators and 4 governors and the General Counsel of the Republican National Committee and 4 past General Counsels and the American Farm Bureau and the National Taxpayers Union and the former President of the National Rifle Association and the Director of Gun Owners of America and all kinds of national conservative leaders who support what we're doing. But what we're still building is that grassroots army of people who will bring this idea up from the bottom and who will demonstrate to the media that this is a concern of the millennial generation. All the political leaders in Washington don't have as much firepower in the media as you do if you can mobilize your generation.